No war in history had been broadcast live to a global audience the way the Gulf War was in January 1991, with CNN cameras capturing the opening airstrikes on Baghdad in real time as hundreds of millions watched from their living rooms. The Vietnam War had dragged on for years, with unclear objectives and mounting casualties shown on evening news after battles had ended. The Soviet war in Afghanistan became a grinding stalemate, largely hidden from public view. The Iran-Iraq war consumed 8 years in pointless slaughter that the world barely noticed. Yet the Gulf War, from the beginning of the air campaign to ceasefire, lasted just 43 days, produced footage broadcast live as bombs fell, and missiles launched, and demonstrated a level of military technological superiority that shocked even those who thought they understood American power. The war began with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and ended with Iraqi forces routed from Kuwait by the end of February 1991, leaving Saddam Hussein still in power and setting the stage for another war 12 years later. August 2, 1990, at 2 o'clock in the morning local time, Iraqi Republican Guard divisions crossed the border into Kuwait with more than 100,000 troops supported by tanks and helicopter gunships. Kuwaiti border guards, vastly outnumbered and caught by surprise, offered scattered resistance before being overwhelmed. Within 12 hours, Iraqi forces had seized Kuwait City, and the Emir of Kuwait had fled to Saudi Arabia. By August 4th, Saddam Hussein announced the annexation of Kuwait as Iraq's 19th province, declaring that the liberation of stolen Iraqi territory was complete. Saddam Hussein's decision to invade Kuwait emerged from the catastrophic aftermath of his war against Iran, which had ended just 2 years earlier in August 1988, with Iraq devastated economically and burdened with debts exceeding $80 billion to Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states who had financed Iraq's war effort. Saddam believed these debts should be forgiven as payment for Iraq's role defending the Arab world against Persian expansion, but Kuwait and Saudi Arabia insisted on repayment, creating tensions that Saddam saw as an opportunity to resolve through force. Kuwait represented an attractive target for multiple reasons beyond debt forgiveness. The tiny emirate possessed vast oil reserves that would give Iraq control of approximately 20% of global oil production if combined with Iraqi fields. Kuwait's deep water ports would provide Iraq the Gulf access it had always lacked, and Saddam believed, based on signals he interpreted from American diplomats, including Ambassador April Glaspie, that the United States would not intervene in what Washington might view as an inter-Arab dispute. This calculation proved catastrophically wrong. The invasion of Kuwait threatened Saudi Arabia, America's key ally in the region and the world's largest oil producer. It gave Saddam control over oil resources that could destabilize global markets, and it represented exactly the kind of interstate aggression that the end of the Cold War was supposed to make obsolete, with President George H.W. Bush declaring that this aggression would not stand and that a new world order based on international law required reversing Iraq's conquest. Within days of the invasion, the United States began deploying forces to Saudi Arabia in Operation Desert Shield, initially to deter Iraqi attack on Saudi oil fields, but rapidly expanding into a massive buildup aimed at liberating Kuwait. President Bush assembled an unprecedented international coalition, including not just traditional NATO allies, but Arab states like Egypt and Syria, securing United Nations authorization for the use of force if Iraq did not withdraw by January 15, 1991. Through autumn and winter 1990, American and coalition forces poured into Saudi Arabia in a deployment that eventually reached more than 500,000 American troops plus substantial forces from Britain, France, Egypt, Syria, and other coalition members. General Norman Schwarzkopf commanded coalition forces, overseeing the largest American military deployment since Vietnam, while planners developed an air campaign designed to cripple Iraqi forces before ground operations began. Saddam Hussein, meanwhile, fortified Iraqi positions in Kuwait and along the Saudi border, creating defensive lines with trenches, minefields, and obstacles designed to inflict heavy casualties on attacking forces. Iraqi propaganda proclaimed that coalition forces would face the mother of all battles, where American soldiers would drown in their own blood. Saddam moved Western hostages to strategic sites as human shields, released them only after international pressure mounted, and attempted to split the coalition by offering to withdraw from Kuwait if Israel withdrew from occupied Palestinian territories, a linkage the coalition rejected. The January 15, 1991 deadline passed, with Iraq still occupying Kuwait and showing no signs of withdrawal. The world waited to see if war would actually begin, with protests in many countries opposing military action and predictions of tens of thousands of casualties if coalition forces attacked entrenched Iraqi positions defended by an army that had fought Iran for 8 years. January 17, 1991, at 2:38 in the morning, Baghdad time, the air war began. American F-117 stealth fighters struck command and control targets in Baghdad, while Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea flew through the night toward Iraqi positions. Within minutes, Baghdad's night sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire as Iraqi defenders, unable to detect the stealth aircraft with radar, fired blindly at sounds and shadows. CNN correspondent Bernard Shaw, reporting live from the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad, described explosions lighting up the sky as viewers worldwide watched the opening of the air campaign in real time. The footage showed tracer rounds arcing into the darkness, flashes of explosions, and the eerie green glow of night vision cameras capturing scenes that looked like science fiction but were brutally real. This was the first war broadcast live on television from its opening moments, creating images that would define the conflict for a global audience. The air campaign targeted Iraqi command and control, air defenses, communications, bridges, military production facilities, and chemical weapons storage sites in a systematic effort to destroy Iraq's ability to coordinate defense or launch counterattacks. American F-15 and F-16 fighters achieved air superiority within days as Iraqi pilots, facing technological superiority they could not match, either fled to Iran or remained grounded to preserve aircraft. Stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and overwhelming numbers gave coalition air forces freedom to strike targets across Iraq and Kuwait with minimal losses. The air campaign continued for 38 days, flying more than 100,000 sorties and dropping 88,500 tons of bombs on Iraqi positions. Iraqi forces in Kuwait, subjected to relentless bombardment, saw their command structure collapse, their supply lines severed, and their fortified positions systematically destroyed. Coalition aircraft struck the Republican Guard divisions positioned in reserve behind Kuwaiti defensive lines, degrading the elite forces Saddam had planned to use in counterattacks. Unable to contest coalition air superiority, Iraq launched Scud missiles at Saudi Arabia and Israel in attacks designed to kill civilians, terrorize populations, and potentially draw Israel into the war in ways that might fracture the Arab coalition members who could not be seen fighting alongside Israel against fellow Arabs. The Scuds, modified Soviet missiles with extended range but reduced accuracy, could not hit military targets reliably but could strike cities. On January 18th, Iraqi Scuds struck Tel Aviv and Haifa in Israel, causing damage and casualties while creating panic as Israeli citizens donned gas masks, fearing chemical warheads that fortunately did not materialize. The Israeli government, under intense pressure from its population to retaliate, prepared military responses, but held back after American entreaties and promises to hunt Iraqi missile launchers with special operations forces and aircraft. Patriot missile batteries deployed to Saudi Arabia and Israel to intercept incoming Scuds, engaged the missiles with mixed results that would be debated for years, with initial claims of high intercept rates later questioned, though the Patriot's presence provided psychological reassurance to populations under attack. American and British Special Forces teams operated deep in Iraqi territory, searching for mobile Scud launchers, achieving limited success against weapons that could be moved quickly after firing. By late February 1991, the air campaign had destroyed much of Iraq's military capability in Kuwait and degraded the Republican Guard divisions in southern Iraq. Coalition commanders judged that Iraqi forces were sufficiently weakened for ground operations to begin. On February 24th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, coalition ground forces launched a massive assault from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait and Iraq. The coalition plan, developed by Schwarzkopf and his staff, featured multiple axes of attack designed to confuse Iraqi defenders about the main effort. United States Marines and Arab coalition forces attacked directly into Kuwait, engaging Iraqi defensive positions and drawing attention. Meanwhile, the main effort involved American and British armored divisions conducting a massive left hook through the Iraqi desert west of Kuwaiti defensive lines, racing north into Iraq, then turning east to attack Republican Guard positions from an unexpected direction. The ground war unfolded with stunning speed as Iraqi defensive lines, pounded by weeks of airstrikes and manned by demoralized troops suffering from supply shortages, collapsed within hours. Iraqi soldiers surrendered in masses, some waving white flags at helicopters and aircraft, others walking toward coalition lines to give up rather than continue fighting. The defensive positions Saddam had proclaimed would produce the mother of all battles were bypassed or overrun with minimal resistance. American M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles raced across the desert, covering distances that exceeded even optimistic planning estimates. British Challenger tanks engaged Iraqi armor at ranges where Iraqi gunners could not effectively return fire, using thermal sights to identify targets through smoke and dust. The few serious engagements, including the Battle of 73 Easting, where American cavalry units destroyed an entire Iraqi brigade in a running fight, demonstrated overwhelming technological and tactical superiority. By February 26th, coalition forces had cut off Iraqi retreat routes from Kuwait, encircling thousands of Iraqi troops attempting to flee north toward Basra. The Basra Road, later called the Highway of Death, became a killing ground where coalition aircraft attacked a massive traffic jam of Iraqi military vehicles, civilian cars, and looted goods fleeing Kuwait, destroying hundreds of vehicles and killing an unknown number of Iraqi soldiers in scenes that would later raise questions about whether the attacks constituted appropriate military action or unnecessary slaughter of defeated forces. Kuwait City was liberated on February 27th by Arab coalition forces who entered the capital to find a city ransacked by retreating Iraqi troops who had looted homes, businesses, and museums while setting more than 700 oil wells on fire, creating an environmental disaster that would take months to control. The fires burned with such intensity that day turned to night across much of Kuwait as black smoke blocked sunlight, creating apocalyptic scenes of destruction. On February 28, 1991, after exactly 100 hours of ground combat, President Bush ordered a ceasefire. Iraqi forces had been routed from Kuwait. The Republican Guard had been badly damaged, though not destroyed, and continuing the war risked killing Iraqi soldiers who were clearly defeated and attempting to retreat. Bush, Schwarzkopf, and civilian leadership judged that the UN mandate to liberate Kuwait had been achieved, and that advancing to Baghdad to overthrow Saddam Hussein would exceed that mandate while potentially fracturing the coalition and leaving American forces occupying a hostile country. The ceasefire took effect at 8 o'clock in the morning on February 28th, though sporadic fighting continued in some areas where word had not reached all units. The war that military planners had predicted might last months and produce tens of thousands of casualties had instead lasted 43 days, with coalition combat deaths numbering fewer than 400, including 148 Americans killed in action. Iraqi casualties were harder to determine, but estimates ranged from 20,000 to 35,000 killed, with tens of thousands more wounded and approximately 80,000 taken prisoner. The victory appeared total. Kuwait was liberated, Iraqi military power was shattered, and coalition forces had demonstrated technological and tactical dominance that exceeded even optimistic assessments. Schwarzkopf appeared on television explaining battle plans with maps showing the left hook that had trapped Iraqi forces, while images of burning oil fields, destroyed Iraqi armor, and surrendering Iraqi soldiers dominated news coverage. Yet Saddam Hussein remained in power in Baghdad, having survived military defeat just as he had survived the Iran-Iraq War. Within weeks, his Republican Guard divisions, though damaged, would suppress uprisings by Shia in southern Iraq and Kurds in the north, rebellions that American rhetoric had encouraged but American forces did not support. The ceasefire terms, negotiated hastily, allowed Iraq to continue flying helicopters which Saddam used to attack rebels, creating humanitarian disasters that would require coalition intervention to establish no-fly zones protecting Kurds and Shia from government retaliation. The Gulf War demonstrated American military dominance in conventional warfare at a level that surprised even American commanders, with stealth technology, precision weapons, satellite communications, and professional forces overwhelming an opponent who had been considered a serious regional military power. The war validated investments in technology and training made during the 1980s, showing that American forces could deploy globally, coordinate complex operations, and achieve decisive victory against peer competitors. The coalition assembled for the war represented unprecedented international cooperation, including not just Western allies, but Arab states and nations like Syria that had been Soviet clients during the Cold War. United Nations authorization legitimized the military action in ways that contrasted sharply with controversial interventions like Vietnam, demonstrating that the post-Cold War world might indeed operate under a new world order where international law constrained aggression and collective security functioned when vital interests aligned. The war's live television coverage transformed how publics experienced military conflict, with CNN's Bernard Shaw reporting from Baghdad as bombs fell and press briefings showing video from precision-guided weapons striking targets, creating an impression of surgical warfare where technology minimized casualties and collateral damage. This sanitized presentation of warfare, while based on real technological advances, obscured the reality that thousands of Iraqi soldiers died in the air campaign and ground offensive, that civilian infrastructure was destroyed alongside military targets, and that the highway of death represented slaughter however justified by military necessity, establishing patterns of media management and public perception that would influence how future conflicts were presented to domestic audiences. Yet the decision to end the war without removing Saddam Hussein from power would haunt American policy for the next decade and ultimately lead to another war in 2003. Saddam survived, rebuilt his military to some degree, and continued threatening neighbors and repressing his own population while evading UN weapons inspections designed to ensure Iraq had destroyed weapons of mass destruction programs. The unfinished nature of the Gulf War, with Saddam still ruling from Baghdad, created an unsustainable situation where American forces remained deployed in the region, enforcing no-fly zones and sanctions that harmed Iraqi civilians while failing to remove the regime. The highway of death and images of destroyed Iraqi forces raised questions about proportionality and the ethics of using overwhelming force against defeated opponents attempting to retreat, though these concerns were largely overshadowed by celebrations of liberation and military success at the time. The environmental catastrophe of Kuwait's burning oil wells, deliberately set by retreating Iraqi forces, demonstrated how modern warfare affects not just combatants but entire regions, with ecological damage and economic costs lasting years after fighting ends and creating precedents for how environmental destruction might be used as weapon in future conflicts. For the United States military, the Gulf War restored confidence shattered by Vietnam and validated the all-volunteer force concept, showing that professional soldiers were superior to conscripts in modern warfare, requiring technological sophistication and complex coordination. The war influenced American military doctrine for decades, emphasizing overwhelming force, precision weapons, air superiority, and rapid maneuver as keys to victory, while perhaps encouraging overconfidence that these advantages would translate to conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, where insurgencies rather than conventional armies presented the challenge, and where technological superiority could not compensate for unclear political objectives or insufficient understanding of local populations. For Iraq, the war was catastrophic defeat, compounded by international isolation as sanctions remained in place for 12 years, crippling the economy and creating humanitarian suffering while failing to remove Saddam or fundamentally change Iraqi behavior. The war's unfinished nature, with Saddam surviving and American forces maintaining presence in the region, created conditions that would eventually produce the 2003 invasion, based partly on unfinished business from 1991 and partly on claims about weapons programs that proved largely unfounded, demonstrating how incomplete victories can generate pressures for renewed conflict years later. The Gulf War teaches that military victory, however decisive in conventional terms, does not necessarily achieve lasting political solutions if the underlying problems remain unresolved and political objectives beyond defeating enemy forces are unclear or unachievable. It demonstrates that assembling international coalitions and operating under UN mandates constrains military action in ways that may prevent achieving complete victory even when such constraints serve legitimate purposes of maintaining international cooperation and legal frameworks. And it shows that decisions made during wartime, including when to stop fighting and what objectives to pursue, have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate conflict and can shape regional dynamics for decades. The war that began with Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and ended with ceasefire on February 28, 1991, was a military triumph and political complication, achieving its stated objective of liberating Kuwait while leaving Saddam Hussein in power to threaten the region for another 12 years until American forces returned to finish what the Gulf War had left incomplete.